in terms of the deadline, how different did this one play out from ones you've experienced? I mean, it just felt like there was such a clear lack of sellers. There were a couple of teams, but, we're used to, in years past, possibly half the league being looked at as sellers. How different was this year's deadline compared to ones you've worked in the past?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're going to see more of moving forward. I'm not sure this is what the league thought or hoped, but I really think with the extra wild card team or playoff spot right in each league, there's more and more teams who feel like they're at least within striking distance, 4 or 5 games of that third wild card. It becomes difficult to signal to your fan base that you're not going to do something. So I think that we're going to see this from the next couple of years too. And this is only the second year that we've had this second wild card, so we don't really have a huge history on that. But I do think that if you're a GM, and we saw a lot of these teams go, even the last week before the deadline, unsure which direction they were going to go. They were a 4 or 5 game win streak from being a buyer, and basically a 4 or 5 game losing streak from being a seller. So I think it's good from that side of things because it keeps teams competitive leading up to the trade deadline. But I think that the activity of trading back and forth is going to take a little bit of a hit, not just this year, but in coming years.
So I wanted to ask you about 2 teams that had similar off seasons this past off season with the Mets and the Padres, and then have had similar results in the regular season so far, and then had completely different approaches to the trade deadline. What'd you make of those 2 teams? Because I thought it was fascinating to juxtapose those 2 teams against each other in their approaches at the deadline.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm in New York. I do some pre and post for the Mets, so I'm watching the Mets a lot, and obviously I have my history with them as well. And they're the one thing at the deadline you got to have is a direction, right? One way or the other, in or out. And I think both of them chose a direction. People can disagree with what they decided to do at the end of the day, but I think the Mets sent a clear signal to listen. We have underachieved. There's something wrong with the team. There's been a chemistry issue, which is impossible to fix at the trade deadline, no matter who you bring in. And so, and they just felt like the team isn't good enough, and they spent all of this money. And so the owner said, you know what? I want to try to get something for my investment, even if I have to. At the end of the day, if Verlander's option gets picked up by the Astros, the owner of the Mets will have paid other teams over $80 million to have Verlander and Scherzer pitch for somebody else. That's absurd. Yeah. So he's not getting any marks for style points, or his negotiating skills aren't very good, but he got some really good prospects if you like prospects. So that I like the guys they got. I don't think that it was all that difficult to do that. I think anybody could have done it. So I'm kind of on the fence with what they did. If they are good next year, if they put money back into the team with more starting pitching, okay, then I can say they took a half a season and walked away. The Padres, I think, if there's a team that you look at, you go, man, that team also is lacking in chemistry, and they're bad, and they're underachieving. They could have and should have probably done the same thing, but their GM told me on my radio show 2 weeks ago that he was going to buy and just try to improve the team around the fringes, which is basically what he did. Right? He just added pieces that improved the club with a back end, a starter, and a bat at first base, and a bat off the bench, and then a reliever. They didn't get anything impactful, but he needs his impactful players currently to do something, or else they're not going anywhere either.
You mentioned the idea of chemistry, and it's such a kind of funny idea in baseball, right? Because of all team sports, It is far and away the most individualistic, but it's also not nothing. You do want to build a team that has some semblance of culture, identity, however you want to word it. I look at a group like the Blue Jays, and some of the moves they made this last offseason, yes, it was to change the makeup of the ball club, but they also weren't shy about part of it was, trading for a different personality or a different feel of a player. How hard of a thing is as that to get a gauge for as a general manager? Because on one hand, baseball is the game that you're around every day, but I also don't know how much a GM is around the players to kind of have a gauge for that. How important is it for a GM to have a feel for that? And I guess how important is chemistry in the sport, really?
Well, I think the idea of chemistry is a fascinating one because not everybody believes that you need good chemistry on your team to win. And I completely disagree. And there's a lot of GMs who completely disagree, but there are a good number of not just general managers that think it's overrated. And I'm not suggesting, when I say I believe it, I'm not saying overpay for a great guy in the clubhouse, right? So it's all within, like, you want players that can play, the bottom line. Mm-hmm. But they got to get along, right? And this would be like in the workplace, you're working, 80-hour work weeks, and you don't like the people that you're working with on a regular basis. Like, that is just miserable every day to go to. And that's what it is when you have a team that doesn't have good chemistry. It's not fun. They don't get along real well, and everybody kind of has their own little corner and clique. And when things go bad, which they invariably do during the season, you don't have any type of group where we're going to pull together and get out of this on our own. They're kind of going their own separate ways. And that's when I think the chemistry matters the most. So, I've been through both when we've had good teams and good chemistry. When we've had good teams and bad chemistry, it didn't matter. But, man, when we were struggling and we didn't have good chemistry, that ship sunk fast. So I'm a big believer in it just because I've seen it, over the years. And when you go into a clubhouse that's won or winning, it is noticeable. It's palpable. You can feel it. And it's just because I've been in clubhouses so much, they like each other. They like being around each other. Like it's something that you can definitely feel, even as a GM, if you're around the team enough.
So just wanted to zoom in on the Jays with you here, and they're obviously locked in a scary series against the Baltimore Orioles, who, added Jack Flaherty at the deadline, but just specifically with the Jays, what'd you make of their trade deadline? Not enough, maybe one extra right-handed bat, adding Hicks, adding DeYoung, adding Yenesis Cabrera, all Cardinals, actually, they just added. They just took 3 guys from the Cardinals. Right, but what did you make of their deadline, their lack of their movement, what they did? What'd you make of it?
Well, the thing that, what they were really, unfortunately, what they were doing, at least for the moment, was plugging holes, because of injuries, right, with Romano and Hicks. Like, eventually, when Romano comes back, like, that bullpen's going to be scary good. Like, I like what they did with Hicks. Like, and if you were, a smoker, right, a cigarette smoker, like Jordan Hicks, he'll smoke a whole pack when he's on the mound. So he's going to walk a couple guys. You guys are going to, it's going to drive you nuts.
Don't tempt me with a good time, buddy.
Right. So, I just think of Jim Leland having the heaters down there in the dugout because his relievers aren't throwing strikes. It drove him nuts, right? So I like that one. Paul DeYoung isn't going to do much other than he's going to catch the ball, especially while Bo's out. Hopefully he's not going to be out long. And Cabrera, Cabrera's had his struggles. But I don't think Toronto needs to do a heck of a lot. And, let's say when Bo comes back, DeYoung's going to, has the ability to hit a home run coming off the bench. He can play multiple positions. So, I mean, there are teams that did more, but I liked the specific moves that Toronto did. And they're a team that I keep waiting for them to take off. We're going to talk to John Schneider on my show today.
Oh, nice.
But, the last, 56 games, I think there's like 33 and 23, something like that, or right around that. So, I mean, it's a pretty good run over a longer period of time. So they've been trending up. It's just been a little bit slower than other teams have gone on a, win 10 out of 15, out of 12 or 15 out of 20. They haven't quite done that yet, but I think it's coming for them.
Yeah, it's just the hard part about the Jays record, Jim, and what drives everybody crazy here is the inability to get a win in their own division. They're 7-22 in their own division, right? And it's like they're so.
How is that possible?
I know they're 1-7 now against the Orioles and the Red Sox so far this season. It's just like it's not That's why it feels so bad, because every team that every fan in the city hates comes in here and kind of beats them pretty badly. So that's why it feels so bad. But you're right. They've been good over this last little stretch. They just kind of got to – feels like they haven't gotten it into top gear yet. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. The runners in scoring position thing is driving them nuts, but they do have the potential to get hot.
Well, they do. And I think that's the thing. Like, okay, there's also some belief because they're a good team. Like, if you look at the roster and, all right, so maybe they haven't achieved quite where they should be. But if you're a underachieving team out there and you can say you're 10 games over 500, I think they would sign up for it, right? Like, so the Padres would certainly do it, and so would the Mets. Those are really underachieving teams. So I think that, the best is still to come for Toronto. And, sometimes these moves that you make at the deadline are kind of a little bit of a different energy that changes things up. But I also feel this, like, if you're a good enough team, those numbers should get better down the stretch. And I'll take it, like, last year, Philadelphia early in the season was horrible in the NL East, specifically against the Mets, but they just could not beat. I don't think they beat Atlanta. And then as the last 3 months unfolded, they were a team that they evened it out and basically went on a tear. And I feel like in some ways, Toronto didn't have that bad run like Philly did last year. But I feel like in some ways Toronto is in that similar situation where when they start to get hot, that they're going to be a team that you just don't want to play down the stretch. So hopefully that's going to happen soon, obviously.
Yeah, a lot of people just hope it's when and not if, because I think there's a lot of people still thinking it might be if for this team this year.
Right.
Last one for you before we let you go, more of a kind of philosophical question. What's the hardest part of a ball club to build as a general manager? Because, I mean, the lineup requires the most pieces, but you can also maybe get away with a few lesser ones. A bullpen, it's so finicky, but it feels like you have to rebuild it every year. And a rotation, you could kind of go the same way, but there's more swing and miss, for lack of a better term, in starting pitchers. As a executive, what's kind of the hardest part of a ball club to build?
Well, it's like there's so many different aspects to it. I personally think that just pitching in general, so it's kind of a broader question. Like, you just can never have enough depth, starting or relievers, right? Because, like you've said, the bullpen is very inconsistent from year to year. You hardly ever have the same guys back-to-back years have the same type years. They start there, so it's problematic. But I'll say it's easier to kind of fix that because there's always going to be, somebody you can plug in, or it's a little easier to trade for relief help. Starting pitching for me, as I talk this out with you, my answer is probably going to turn towards starting pitching because, if you have a guy that goes down, you don't have usually a guy in your stable sitting there in the minor leagues that can replace the guy to get injured, right? And how do you carry 7 or 8, starting pitches? No one has that many. No one's that deep. So, trying to keep them healthy, trying to build a deep rotation is probably the most difficult. And if you don't have one, it's expensive. It's expensive to trade for. It's expensive to buy. So I probably would lean more to starting pitching wise.